Picture a Sunday afternoon in October. A woman, let's call her Maria, is walking through the grocery store. Nothing unusual. She's done this every week for 30 years. But today is different. Today there's a sale on canned tomatoes and rice and cooking oil. So she does what any reasonable person would do. She buys extra. 3 extra cans of tomatoes, 2 extra bags of rice, an extra bottle of oil. She's not panicking. She's not preparing for the apocalypse. She's just doing what her grandmother taught her. Keep a little more than you need because you never know. She gets to the register, and the cashier gives her a look. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Store policy limits purchases to 2 per customer per item." Maria nods, puts a few things back, and goes home. She doesn't think much of it. But here's what she doesn't know. That quiet moment at the register, that small, mundane limit on how much she's allowed to buy, is the visible tip of a legal, regulatory, and economic architecture that has been quietly constructed around her for years. And it is expanding. Let's define the terms clearly, because the language matters enormously here. There is a difference between hoarding and stockpiling. Hoarding, in the classical economic sense, means artificially withholding goods from the market to create scarcity and drive up prices. It is a market manipulation strategy. It damages communities. Laws against it have existed for centuries. Stockpiling means an individual or household accumulating a personal reserve of goods for private use, typically for preparedness, frugality, or insurance against supply disruption. These are not the same thing. One harms the market, the other protects the individual from the market's failures. For most of modern history, governments and legal systems understood this distinction. A family keeping 3 months of food in their basement was called prudent. In fact, during both World War I and World War II, governments actively encouraged civilian stockpiling as part of national preparedness strategy. What's happening now is different. The distinction is being quietly erased. And in its place, a set of laws, policies, store regulations, and in some countries, outright criminal statutes are treating the prepared individual as a threat to the system. The question worth asking is, a threat to which system exactly? Let's follow the timeline because it starts earlier than most people think. After the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, images of empty shelves, toilet paper, hand sanitizer, flour circulated globally. The public narrative around hoarding intensified. Governments used emergency powers to impose purchase limits on essential goods. Retailers implemented their own restrictions. Most people accepted this as a temporary crisis response. But temporary measures have a well-documented historical tendency to become permanent infrastructure. By 2021 and 2022, several countries had begun formalizing what were initially emergency purchase restrictions into standing regulations. France passed legislation in 2022 allowing the state to regulate distribution of essential goods during declared crises, with the definition of crisis left deliberately broad. In the United Kingdom, legislation under the Civil Contingencies Act already granted the government sweeping powers to regulate, requisition, and control the distribution of food, water, and fuel during emergencies, powers that have never been fully tested but also never been rescinded. In the United States, Executive Order 14603, signed in 2012 and still technically active, grants federal agencies the authority to allocate resources, including food and water, during national emergencies. It has rarely been invoked, but it exists, and it is in place. In parts of the European Union, post-pandemic supply chain legislation has introduced frameworks that allow governments to redirect private stockpiles of critical goods during declared shortages. None of these laws announce themselves loudly. None of them say, "We are limiting your right to prepare." They say, "We are managing resources during critical times." The framing is always management, never control. But here's where it gets structurally interesting. To understand why these laws are appearing now, you have to understand what changed in the global supply chain, and who benefits from a world where individuals cannot maintain their own reserves. The modern supply chain is built on a philosophy called just-in-time manufacturing. The logic is elegant and efficient. Don't produce more than you need right now. Don't store more than you'll use in the next few days. Keep inventory lean. Keep capital flowing. Waste nothing. This model was pioneered by Toyota in Japan in the 1970s and exported globally as the gold standard of industrial efficiency. By the 1990s and 2000s, it had been applied not just to manufacturing, but to food distribution, pharmaceutical supply, and retail. The result is a supply chain that is extraordinarily efficient and extraordinarily fragile. A global just-in-time supply chain has no buffer. When something disrupts it, a pandemic, a war, a shipping blockage, a climate event, the shelves don't thin out gradually. They empty, suddenly, completely. The system is designed to operate with zero margin. And zero margin means that individual stockpiling, personal buffers, family reserves, actually threatens the mathematical elegance of the model. Because if millions of individuals suddenly pull forward their demand by buying 6 months of supplies, the just-in-time system doesn't have the inventory to absorb it. It breaks, and so the question becomes, rather than build more resilient supply chains, is it cheaper and simpler to prevent individuals from stockpiling at all? The economics suggest yes. Now let's add the corporate dimension, because no analysis of modern policy is complete without asking who profits. The food and retail industry has a specific economic relationship with stockpiling that is rarely discussed openly. When you buy a year's worth of rice today, you are removing yourself from the purchase cycle for the next 12 months. You are, in economic terms, a lost customer for that period. At scale, mass individual stockpiling is a direct threat to recurring consumer revenue. Subscription grocery models, meal kit delivery services, and the increasingly popular automatic replenishment systems run by Amazon and major retailers are all built on one core assumption: that you will return to the market regularly, predictably, perpetually. A family with 3 months of food stored in their basement is a less profitable family than one who shops fresh every 3 days. This is not speculation. It is a business model. And when corporate interests and government regulatory interests converge, as they often do in the space between lobbying and policy, the resulting laws tend to serve both. Regulations that limit stockpiling protect just-in-time supply chains from disruption. They also protect the recurring revenue models of the largest food and retail corporations on the planet. The prepared individual is, from a systems perspective, a problem to be managed. Let's look at what's happening at the international policy level, because the picture gets more structured the higher you look. The World Economic Forum, which coordinates between governments, central banks, and major corporations, has published extensively on the concept of food system resilience. Within that literature is a consistent framework. Centralized food reserves managed by national or international bodies are presented as more efficient and equitable than decentralized individual stockpiling. The logic is seductive. Why have 10 million families, each storing 60 days of food imperfectly with waste and inefficiency, when a centralized system can do it better? The answer, which the literature rarely addresses directly, is this: centralized control of food reserves means centralized control of food access. History is unambiguous on this point. The Soviet Union's collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s, which transferred grain storage from individual farms and families to state granaries, preceded one of the worst famines in the 20th century. The Holodomor in Ukraine killed millions, not because there wasn't food, but because the food was controlled by a system that decided who received it and when. In Maoist China, the Great Leap Forward similarly centralized food production and distribution. The result was a famine that killed between 15 and 45 million people between 1959 and 1961. These are extreme cases. The point is not that modern Western governments are planning famines. The point is that when individuals lose the capacity to maintain their own food security, they become entirely dependent on the competence and goodwill of whatever system controls the supply. And systems, as history shows, are neither always competent nor always good. Now, let's be precise, because precision is what separates analysis from panic. In most Western countries today, personal food stockpiling for household use is still legal. The legal restrictions currently in place target primarily commercial stockpiling, purchasing large quantities of goods with intent to resell at inflated prices. This is the classical definition of hoarding, and prosecuting it is defensible. But the boundaries are being tested and, in some cases, quietly moved. In South Korea, laws have been used to prosecute individuals who stockpiled agricultural goods during price spikes, even when the intent was personal use. In India, the Essential Commodities Act allows the government to set limits on how much of certain goods any individual can legally possess. In several Gulf states, stockpiling of specific goods above defined quantities is a criminal offense, regardless of intent. These are not hypothetical futures. They are present realities in large, functioning countries with millions of citizens. And the regulatory infrastructure, the emergency powers, the executive orders, the supply chain management frameworks, exists in most developed nations to move in the same direction if political conditions change. The direction of travel matters, even when you haven't arrived at the destination. There's one more layer to examine, and it may be the most structurally significant: digital payment systems. As economies move from cash to digital transactions, accelerated by the pandemic, encouraged by governments and banks globally, every purchase you make becomes data, tracked, categorized, analyzable. In a world of central bank digital currencies, which are being piloted by over 100 countries as of 2024, including China's digital yuan, the European Central Bank's digital euro project, and multiple Federal Reserve research programs, the technical capability to impose not just purchase limits but purchase conditions becomes part of the monetary infrastructure. You don't need a law that says you cannot stockpile rice. You need a payment system that simply declines the transaction when you've exceeded an algorithmically determined threshold. No officer, no court, no visible enforcement, just a declined card and an error message. This is not science fiction. The Chinese social credit system already ties certain purchase categories to behavioral scores. The European Union's digital ID framework, currently in development, envisions integrating financial identity with access to services. The technical architecture of programmable money is, by its nature, the architecture of programmable consumption. And programmable consumption is the end of stockpiling, not through law, but through the quiet impossibility of the transaction. So where does this leave you? Not in panic. Panic is useless. Analysis is useful. Here is what the structural picture actually tells us. First, the right to personal food security, to maintain a reasonable reserve of essentials for your household, is a right that is under slow, quiet, multi-directional pressure. Recognizing this pressure is not paranoia, it is literacy. Second, the just-in-time model, which most people's daily lives now depend on entirely, is a system with no tolerance for disruption. Building personal buffers, not hoarding but reasonable household reserves, is simply risk management. It is what every insurance policy, emergency fund, and spare tire represents in physical form. Third, the convergence of corporate interest, government regulatory expansion, and digital payment infrastructure around the control of consumption is real, documented, and accelerating. Understanding the three-part convergence, retail efficiency, policy frameworks, and monetary digitization is essential for anyone who wants to understand what the next decade of economic life actually looks like. And fourth, historical patterns are consistent. Societies that centralize control over essential resources, regardless of the ideology behind the centralization, tend to produce the same outcome. The people closest to the center eat first. The people farthest from it wait. Here is the conclusion. Not the alarming one, but the honest one. Every generation believes it is living in unprecedented times. Every generation is, in some ways, correct. But the underlying patterns, the slow centralization of resource control, the gradual erosion of individual economic autonomy, the conversion of citizens into dependent consumers. These patterns are old. They are as old as the granary. The ancient Egyptians built centralized grain stores, and the pharaoh's administrators decided who ate during famine. Medieval lords controlled the mills and decided what peasants could grind and when. What's new is the sophistication of the infrastructure. What's new is the invisibility of the mechanism. What's new is that the people designing these systems are not wearing crowns. They're wearing lanyards at conferences with very good catering. But the underlying relationship between those who control the supply and those who depend on it is exactly as old as civilization itself. The most powerful response to this reality is not rage. It is not political tribalism. It is not going off-grid tomorrow. It is awareness, calibrated and calm. Because a person who understands the system they live inside is not helpless. They are simply, finally, playing the game with their eyes open. And now, so are you. If this is the kind of analysis you want more of, the kind that traces the invisible architecture of the systems that shape your daily life, you already know what to do next. The algorithm remembers what you tell it matters. Make sure it knows this does.